Manually raising, throwing, an exception in Python. How do I raise an exception in Python so that it can later be caught via an except block?
How do I manually throw/raise an exception in Python? Use the most specific exception constructor that semantically fits your issue. Be specific in your message, for example. Don't raise generic exceptions. Avoid raising a generic exception. To catch it, you'll have to catch all other more specific exceptions that subclass it. Problem 1. Hiding bugs. For example, Problem 2. Won't catch. And more specific catches won't catch the general exception. Best practices: raise statement. Instead, use the most specific exception constructor that semantically fits your issue, which also handily allows an arbitrary number of arguments to be passed to the constructor. These arguments are accessed by the args attribute on the exception object. For example, prints. In Python 2.5, an actual message attribute was added to base exception in favor of encouraging users to subclass exceptions and stop using args, but the introduction of message and the original deprecation of args has been retracted. Best practices: except clause. When inside an except clause, you might want to, for example, log that a specific type of error happened, and then re-raise. The best way to do this while preserving the stack trace is to use a bare raise statement. For example, don't modify your errors. But if you insist, you can preserve the stack trace and error value with sys.exc_info, but this is way more error prone and has compatibility problems between Python 2 and 3. Prefer to use a bare raise to re-raise. To explain, the sys.exc_info returns the type, value, and traceback. This is the syntax in Python 2. Note this is not compatible with Python 3. If you want to, you can modify what happens with your new raise, for example setting new args for the instance. And we have preserved the whole traceback while modifying the args. Note that this is not a best practice and it is invalid syntax in Python 3, making keeping compatibility much harder to work around. In Python 3, again, avoid manually manipulating tracebacks. It's less efficient and more error-prone. And if you're using threading and sys.exc_info, you may even get the wrong traceback, especially if you're using exception handling for control flow, which I personally tend to avoid. Python 3, exception chaining. In Python 3, you can chain exceptions, which preserve tracebacks. Be aware. This does allow changing the error type raised, and this is not compatible with Python 2. Deprecated methods. These can easily hide and even get into production code. You want to raise an exception, and doing them will raise an exception, but not the one intended. Valid in Python 2, but not in Python 3 is the following. Only valid in much older versions of Python, 2.4 and lower, you may still see people raising strings. In all modern versions, this will actually raise a type error, because you're not raising a base exception type. If you're not checking for the right exception and don't have a reviewer that's aware of the issue, it could get into production. Example usage. I raise exceptions to warn consumers of my API if they're using it incorrectly. Create your own error types when apropos. I want to make an error on purpose, so that it would go into the except. You can create your own error types. If you want to indicate something specific is wrong with your application, just subclass the appropriate point in the exception hierarchy. And usage.
Don't do this. Raising a bare exception is absolutely not the right thing to do. See Aaron Hall's excellent answer instead. It can't get much more Pythonic than this. Replace exception with the specific type of exception you want to throw. See the raise statement documentation for Python if you'd like more information.
In Python 3 there are 4 different syntaxes for raising exceptions. Raise exception, args, raise exception, args, from original _exception. 1. Raise exception versus 2. Raise exception, args. If you use raise exception, args, to raise an exception, then the args will be printed when you print the exception object, as shown in the example below. Three. Statement raise. The raise statement without any arguments re-raises the last exception. This is useful if you need to perform some actions after catching the exception and then want to re-raise it. But if there wasn't any exception before, the raise statement raises a type error exception. Four. Raise exception, args, from original _exception. This statement is used to create exception chaining in which an exception that is raised in response to another exception can contain the details of the original exception, as shown in the example below. Output.
For the common case where you need to throw an exception in response to some unexpected conditions, and that you never intend to catch, but simply to fail fast to enable you to debug from there if it ever happens, the most logical one seems to be assertion error.
human protein moment. He has come to the sustaining.